site. If you require any assistance, just leave a message using the chat panel. The session will be recorded and we will make it available for you after the webinar. Next slide, please. We are Syntegrity and headquartered in Frankfurt. We deliver to the life sciences industry, pharma, biotech, medtech, intelligent RBM cloud applications and services. We do this since 2013 and currently about 450 accounts are using our Attract Risk Assessment tool. Next slide, please. We have the honor today to have as a co-host Nancy Meyerson-Hess. Besides being a patient advocacy leader, Nancy is experienced in leading global clinical development teams in the pharmaceutical, biotech, and contract research areas. Next slide, please. Besides Nancy, also our CEO Artem Andrianov will co-host this session. Artem has a PhD in mathematics and a master's in business administration, finance, and corporate strategy. During his studies, he completed various research projects at GSK, Johnson & Johnson, and ERT. Currently, Artem is heading Syntegrity in the role of CEO. Next slide, please. So let's start the presentation. I'd like to pass control of the live demonstration over to Nancy and Artem, and you may start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. As an introduction, please excuse me if I start to sneeze. However, I've just returned from a business trip from New Delhi yesterday, and I've brought back a slight head cold as my only souvenir. So just bear with me if you hear me sneezing. This is a disclaimer. These views which I will be presenting are my opinions and views and have really nothing to do with any other organization, current or past employer. So what I'd like to do today is to share some thoughts about patient engagement. And what I'd like to focus on is to have a look about what do we mean by patient engagement, patient centricity, patient focus, patient partnering. I'm sure you've heard a lot of different terms for the overall activities of patient engagement. I'd like to also look at, are there potential risks involved in patient engagement? And in the end, what do we need to consider when addressing patient engagement? So we tend to focus our activities on delivering robust data, demonstrating data integrity, and of course, the safety of the patient. These two categories, and I've just selected two categories, are some of the endpoints involving patient involvement. For without the patients, there would be no data and we would have no outcome. So that's really setting the stage about patient engagement. So what is patient engagement? It is including patients in the process of clinical research, clinical development, asking them for their input, involving them in the active co-creation of approaches. It also involves patients very early on in the preclinical phases of drug or device development. It also involves patients in the clinical development, planning, and strategies, and the sharing of regulatory decisions is very, very important. I like to call, and you'll see this in the last line here, I like to call key opinion leaders patients. Our patients are key opinion leaders. They are experts in providing strategic and operational input. This, however, does not eliminate the classical key opinion leader role that some of our investigators have. I really see this as a parallel role to be joined together with the investigators, but specifically to demonstrate the patient's view. What is happening today with patients? And that's why we want to look at the overall situation. Patients are becoming more active. They're searching for information. They are asking questions, not merely accepting what we are offering them as quote unquote information. The days of the God in white, the classical role of doctors, is gone. Patients are moving toward social media, searching the web. They are setting up forums, reaching out to other patients, and they are commenting on treatments, both positive and negative. And of most important, they are not satisfied with not possible. So they are looking for further information in order to make well-informed decisions. What are the risks? There are certain risks that are associated with clinical development and obviously patient engagement. I like to say that the main risk associated with patient engagement would be that if you do not include active patient engagement in your development plans, you risk the opportunity to involve constructive and useful input for successful patient-focused endpoint and successful outcome. In particular, you could go down a path of drug discovery which does not target the patient needs in any way. Or you could be developing clinical trial protocols and obviously the associated documentation to the protocols, such as informed consent, patient diaries, which are not suited to the patient. It might be that the trial protocols could be too complex or loaded with operational burden, which would make it almost impossible for a patient to participate in a clinical trial. And finally, the last point, you could end up with data that is of little benefit to the patients and have little chance of a marketing authorization or successful reimbursement. So those are some of the overall risks. So what are some of the strategies that we can consider undertaking in order to make certain that we have a solid, useful patient engagement approach in place? Well, the first thing is to start very early on in basic research discussions. So this really means going forward, speaking with your investigators, speaking with your researchers. This would be the first thing that we would want you to think about. Bringing patients or patient groups into your organization to discuss things such as strategy and operational planning. This is really a very, very good idea. And obviously, what we like to do is to have a very transparent and open communication so that there will be no differences in opinion and everyone will be on the same page. What are some of the other aspects of patients and patient groups that we need to take care of? Well, one of them really focuses on the formal roles and responsibilities as well as expectations. And this can be very easily taken care of through formal contracts, charters, letters of agreements, very clearly defined so that everyone is aware of what their role, what their responsibility, and the expectations of any interaction would be. When entering into any type of discussion between patients and a team, it is absolutely imperative to make certain that we respect each other, that we are considerate, and that we listen. Listening is a very, very important part of integrating industry with patients or patient groups. And obviously, never promise what is not possible. This again focuses in on the expectations. I mentioned here feedback culture, and feedback culture is very, very important, as we know, in all of our working relationships, but here in particular, even in the early stages of collaboration with patients, feedback is important. It's especially to make certain that those patients who are involved in any types of discussions or advisory work are kept updated on the status and the progress. And that could mean that you acknowledge their contribution, but their contribution is not possible to be implemented, perhaps now, perhaps at a later phase, but to keep that flow of information running. This too reflects upon keeping patients informed, even if they are trial participants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So what are some of the approaches and actions that can be initiated in patient engagement? Well, the first thing one needs to consider is that each company will be different. Each company will have a different need. There'll be larger organizations, smaller ones. And this needs to be mapped. It needs to be in a type of roadmap, meaning your selection of the approaches to your level and scope of patient engagement will have a basis upon the individual company's need. Reaching out, inviting patients to your company. You can have face-to-face meetings. You can attend conferences and meet up with patient groups during the conference. Introduce them to your basic researchers. Introduce them to your marketing team. Introduce them to groups that generally do not have direct or indirect contact with patients. For instance, a medical writer responsible for writing protocols. It will help to increase their frame of reference and understanding of patient needs. Also consider here, very important, having patients as advisory committee members. Invite them to panels so that they can provide you with their expertise. Obviously, as in any type of activity that we do, there are some challenges. And what are they? It is very often that patients may not know your organization. It may well be that your company is a new, dynamic biotech and not well known within patient groups. This is to be expected and can be addressed through various activities, including things such as patient-focused advertising, social media announcements. There are various approaches to letting patients know about your organization and what your research goals are. Another challenge, and we're all faced with this in most of the industry, has to do with lack of resources. It's very, very important that we make certain that we integrate the suitable resources together with time and financial commitment in order to support patient engagement activities. That this is These two go hand in hand and are very, very important in order to be successful. So we started off by mentioning risks of patient engagement in clinical trials. And as mentioned previously, without solid patient engagement in clinical trials, we will encounter various hurdles. So one of them is to develop a treatment without significant benefit to the patients. Very, very important to have your target patient group involved so that you do have a significant benefit as one of your outcomes. Another common risk is that of poor clinical trial recruitment, which we very often experience in our clinical trials. This has often a direct impact due to the operational burden. An increase in operational burden, too time-consuming, or a very complex protocol will be putting patients at a struggle to participate and perhaps even withdrawing from the trial. And obviously, the outcome of a poor recruitment is a risk to missing your timelines and perhaps overriding your budget. So the deliverables are put at risk due to poor recruitment, which could be mitigated through upfront patient participation in the planning and development. So let's look at ways in which patients contribute to clinical trials. As I mentioned, including disease-specific approaches. This is very important to bring on patient groups to get direct feedback for unmet medical needs. They can also provide operational input regarding timelines, what procedures to integrate into your trial. Recruitment of sites. They're very, very good at recommending sites and investigators, and sometimes through their patient network as well. They can put together a very robust recruitment approach. Patients can also participate as patient ambassadors. A patient ambassador can be someone going around providing feedback and speaking on an indication, on a disease state, to groups of doctors, of laypersons. You can also involve patients in patient advisory groups, as I had mentioned, within your organization, and things such as review boards. So the review boards are moving more and more, for instance, from a regulatory perspective, to review documents and submissions. So there's a whole realm of changes that are taking place, allowing and opening up to involving patients in decision making and in formulation of material. So here, as I was mentioning, patients should be involved in co-creation at all developmental phases, meaning, again, start very early on in the development of drug discovery and not just later on in late phase development. Very, very important. Involve your patients in the review and input on operational burden, things such as informed consents. I mentioned previously site selection, looking at patient-focused materials such as diaries, but it could be packaging and it could be formulations. An example, if you are working in a geriatric population, have easy to open medication containers. If you are working in a pediatric indication, have easy to read consents. Maybe use a pictographic examples as well. And obviously, involvement is not just asking the patients to do something. We want to keep them informed on things such as trial progress and results. So what does that mean? It means sharing information with them. If they are participating in providing input to things such as advisory committees, make certain to keep them updated on the progress of that advisory committee and also progress within your own organization. This does not exclude, obviously, trial participants. We must keep up with trial participants in order to make certain that they are aware of the status of the trial. Obviously, maintaining blinding in a blinded study.
Nancy,
So,
I'm sorry for interruption. I just wanted to ask maybe one question. Like, first of all, I wanted to incentivize everybody to ask questions in the meanwhile, so to use chat and not forget about it. So there is an opportunity. And second, Nancy, if I may interrupt in the meanwhile and ask you particular about rare diseases and pediatric studies. What would you advise, or would you advise to involve maybe in pediatric studies patients or even their, for example, parents? What are challenges there, maybe from your experience, and rare diseases as well? So, what do you think as a kind of challenge in this area? So, how do you think?
So going back to, let's start with pediatrics. Pediatrics definitely is focused upon the age of the patient. The younger patients, let's say under 2 or 3 years of age, generally are the main focus will be on the patient, on the parents or the caregiver. However, as the patient becomes older, we are bound to include those patients able to understand the disease state and treatment possibilities. So we need to work in both ways for pediatrics. For the very young patient, the focus is on the parent, and for a little bit older, or let's say teenagers, definitely our focus is on the patient themselves, because it is their and our obligation to inform them and to get their feedback. So that is in itself. Yes.
Did you have some challenges there, which, like in the past, which you would say it didn't work at all, or maybe there was some sort of
yes,
it's very maybe with teenagers, for example. I don't know.
Oh yes. It's very often the case that parents are pushing their children to participate. For instance, but let's focus on clinical trials. That parents are pushing their children to participate in a clinical trial, and the children, the teenagers, are not interested. They may not be interested because they've read about whatever side effects may occur from a treatment. Happens very often in oncology studies. So it's imperative really to have a good informed consent, a good relationship between the investigator or the study nurse with the patient, to be able to see, is this a good candidate? Because the patients, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit later about training. We need to also share training and what our expectations are for participation in a clinical trial with our trial subjects. So children in themselves are a great challenge, and as a teenager, does the teenager care more about, I'll just use the very basic example, hair loss due to a chemotherapeutic agent, or Do they see more of the curative effect of it? So this is always the balance when you're working with a pediatric population.
Thank you.
Now, about rare diseases are actually our main focus over the years to demonstrate success of patient engagement. Rare diseases in themselves, the description of a rare disease is meaning that there are fewer cases of a particular indication. So we've had to, due to a really lack of other sources, result to opening up, reaching out to selected rare disease patient groups to inquire, to ask, to find supportive ways in which to integrate them into our plans and our goals. So absolutely, I think rare diseases have been the vector for establishing the saying patients as partners or patient co-creation, patient-centric. This is really the basis for a patient engagement work.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Okay. So here we are. I just want to share a few screenshots here because I thought it might be interesting to see how the supporting industry is adapting to these changes. So, and here you will see from the EMA, and I've left the sources here if you want to read them, the use of real-world data. And here in particular, the reason why I've selected this one is it's real-world data, not in a late phase of development, but in a development program. So the idea is, again, looking at how we look at real world, what really is happening, the data that is being collected in particular patient groups, integrating them into development programs. Very, very important concept. Let me just share a few other ones. This one is from the FDA website. It's the 21st Century's Cure Act. And I've selected this as well just to show you that the FDA has really incorporated here perspectives of patients into the development of drugs. Now, I think this is from a personal orientation. I find it amazing that we're talking about patients as though we've just discovered them. Still, it's a formalization of a regulatory authority's approach to including patient perspectives in drug development. Here's another screenshot from Faster Cures. I just wanted to share with you another one. Patients count. Yes, patients count. And I think this introduction is very, very suitable for our talk today, that patients' unmet medical needs have been an afterthought. Again, not asking the patients what is important to them, but here again, we need to use it as the starting point, the beginning point, to ask them, what do you need? What do you want? I've selected this screenshot. This is from NovoNordisk from their website. And they have come up with it's called DEEP, a Disease Experience Expert Panel. And what it is it's a panel of disease experience experts. And these are people living with their chronic disease or their relatives. So going back to what I shared with you before, looking at a patient or a caregiver as a key opinion leader, allowing them into formation, allowing them into sharing of their experience in the world of drug development. Here is another example from the Roche group. I've taken this as patient as a partner, again, looking to empower patients in the redefining the healthcare environment on their own terms. So just to show you that the industry is changing and is moving toward here, just go and ask a patient. I'm sure most of you have heard about EUPATI. EUPATI is the European Patient Academy, and EUPATI offers various tools and guidance on patient inclusion and engagement. Now here I've selected just a screenshot to show you the interaction of patients with regulators and industry. So why have I selected this? I've selected this and I've taken these 3 bullet points out of the text to show you that the advisory work that patients are giving to the pharmaceutical industry has increased from a very low 8% to 52%. So this shows the trend moving forward that patients are becoming more and more involved in the work. Regulatory agencies, again, the advisory work of patients from 12% to 40%. Another group, this is from the European Patients Forum. I've taken this one because I think it's very interesting to see for clinical trials. The European Patient Forum is asking for patient involvement in ethics reviews. So why is that? That means the patients should be involved in reviewing clinical trial applications. Autumn, you had asked me about rare disease, and here I think it fits in very nicely. This is another excerpt from EUPATI, but I separated it out. It really shows you that patient organizations are involved in input into rare disease registries, for instance. Again, a function as a key opinion leader for the clinical course of a disease. So very, very important to see that the role of the patient is being integrated into the actual work that's going on. The MHRA, which is the UK regulatory authority, and the UK bio industry. I have a press release here. Just want to show you a little bit. Their focus is on the value of a patient-centered approach in informing and accelerating drug development and lessons learned. And this is very, very important to see this. Again, a statement from the UK regulators. And there are other ones that can be looked at. But I want to show you, finally, just to give you a little overview of what's going on. Here, this is from the UDRELEX, and it has to do with ethics. The statement, if you look here in the bold printing, is when determining the appropriate body or bodies, member states should ensure the involvement of laypersons, in particular, patients or patients' organizations. They should also ensure that the necessary expertise is available. So this is very important, and it's also a statement that, if you recall what I showed you a few slides back from the European Patient Forum, that the movement is toward more involvement of patients, and obviously it doesn't mean every patient, in selected review cycles and in contributions to different documents. So, what does this all mean? Well, what it means is training. What are we looking for? We're looking for ways in which to bring our stakeholders, and here I've really think that we need to put patients together with investigators, with regulators, and also with researchers. We need to look to see what is needed in order to make sure that everyone is aware of what our obligations are, what in a clinical trial, and here I'm just focusing on the clinical trials, what the roles and responsibilities are for patients, for investigators. Very, very important. And again, we have to share best practices as to how to interact with each other. We need to learn what to expect and why certain things are not possible due to compliance obligations. And this is a very fine line and a very important part of learning how to interact with patients or patient groups. In this screenshot, you'll see an excerpt from ICH GCP E6R2. And I've highlighted this just to show you that this is the only, here, this entry 1.57 is the only separate entry referring to a trial subject. It's showing you the importance or let's say, importance. A sub-investigator receives more discipline, receives more description than a trial subject. So what I'm trying to share with you is, even in ICH GCP, even in our latest version, we're still not addressing patients as a standalone, important part of clinical trial development. So let's think about what's happening. So in the end, regulators are going to ask us to demonstrate proof of patient involvement. It's coming. It will be happening. We'll need to demonstrate that we have co-created our development, meaning we have made it so that we've respected patients' needs and interests, that we remain compliant with data protection and regulatory requirements, but that we have targeted the indication together with the suited patient group. We'll also need to make certain that we have respected individual patient needs, that we need to talk about patient involvement, and very, very important, that not all patients will want to be involved. And I mentioned this as a part of my answer to Autumn about, for instance, pediatrics. But you'll find this in all types of work. Not every patient wants to be informed. Not all patients want to receive information. Not all patients will be actively involved in being an advisory member or being a patient ambassador. So this really needs to be very carefully looked at and very carefully selected. So just to conclude, our work in developing new treatments really means that we have to work together as a team. And the team is industry. And when I say industry, I mean pharma, biotech, device companies, CROs, other service providers, regulators, and patients. I have left out the payers in this discussion, basically because of the time, but they too need to be integrated into this. So my thoughts focus really around integrating, involving patients, and I do hope, if nothing else, that you reflect upon how your role within our industry can support patient engagement activities. So I thank you, and I guess we can, have some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nancy. It's really always a pleasure to listen to you. Yes, indeed, we have a couple of questions. Linda, do you want to address them?
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, others can still continue to ask new questions, but the first question that came to us is the following. Are the patient engagement processes and strategies similar for study conducted by academic institutions and by pharmaceuticals? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, and is there an additional cost associated with engaging patients in the process?
Good question. And yes, patient engagement, obviously, be it academic or biotech, we're obligated under similar compliance restrictions. Obviously, the scope of what may be the target in an academic setting might be different from that in a larger pharmaceutical company. So that really needs to be looked at. As I mentioned in my presentation, it's important to roadmap what your expectations are and what your needs are. And I think then it's possible to fine-tune the overall scope of it. Regarding costs, obviously there's always some type of effort involved in these activities. It might be setting up a patient awareness web. It might be sending out information to other hospitals. It might be providing short updates on a particular research target that you would like to involve patients with. So there are various approaches, but yes, there always is an effort, and the effort could be resource, and it could be a financial one, depending upon what the scope of that activity would be.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, go ahead, Artem.
I just wonder, if we speak about involvement, shouldn't we try to involve our audience and ask a couple of questions in the meanwhile, and get maybe some sort of first impression, how the patient engagement are used now in organizations. So for that, we have prepared a couple of questions, and I'm going to launch a poll question right now so that you can vote yourself. And we can try first question and then see how it works, so that everybody could answer. So I'm starting one of the questions that are quite simple. Does your company have a dedicated person or department for patient engagement activities? Yes or no? If you could please vote, I would be very thankful. So we are waiting for a couple of answers so far. So please vote if you see this question. Does your company have a dedicated person or department for patient engagement activities? I'll present the results right away, and it's really striking results as I see. Nancy, do you wish to maybe comment on that?
What I'm seeing is that 100% have no dedicated person or department for patient engagement. Is correct? Oops.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I'm not. It's not unusual, and the trend is most companies have been reticent or slow to adapt to the need for establishing a dedicated person or department. If they're a small group, they may not have the resources and or, let's say, budget for that. There are ways in which this can be compensated. They can work with external groups just for a particular, let's say, activity that they want to undertake. But we are seeing more and more companies are receiving this type of patient engagement as a goal for, let's say, an overall corporate goal to establish an approach toward patient engagement. So I'm not surprised. However, we still need to embrace the movement forward.
Let us try once again with another question. Maybe we will have a bit more luck seeing there some positive movements. Let us. So, do you think that patients should decide what is important as an endpoint in a clinical trial? So, yes or no? Again, feel free to vote your opinion. And again, we will present the results right away. I hope you can see the questions so far right now on the screen.
Can you explain, Artem, what people need to do in order to vote, cast their votes?
So
where do they click?
In order to vote, you should press yes or no if it's if you do see this on your screen so far now.
Oh, okay.
I think there's an issue with the voting.
Yeah, it's something, might be that there is something there. So at least we see that yes, currently is 100%. If somebody wants to vote additionally or further on, you have still a chance. Okay, so far, again, maybe Nancy, you can
absolutely. What I'm seeing is 100% of those who voted think that patients should decide what is important as an endpoint in a clinical trial. And this is...
I think this is, sorry to interrupt, but I can read 0 people voted. So...
Yeah, it might be some issue with voting mechanism. Should we retry it again?
Yes, why not? I
think we should address maybe the questions that were asked earlier on before the time passes. We have an open question, or it's more of a concern, I think, where somebody is asking, are you sure to involve patients in the review of clinical trials? And there was some explanation to it. I was trained that ethic committees defend patients, but with new involvement of the patients, in the studies. I do not really understand the sentence, but anyways, can you should we review them
Yes.
should we involve them in the review of clinical trials?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I did understand the question, and it is correct. Ethics committees were charged with having the patient, let's say, at the forefront. The idea of having a patient with a particular disease be a member of an ethical review process goes back to what we're talking about in asking the patients, involving the patients in deciding what is suitable for them. And not all patients will be participating in an ethics review. These would be patients who would have the ability to either review particular documents, and it might be that it's an informed consent, it might be the operational schedule. There are various ways in which a patient can be involved in an ethical review of a clinical trial protocol. But to date, aside from having a lay representative, we have excluded patients from the ethical review. And I think that we need to reconsider that. That is what I showed you as the screenshot from the Udralex, that this too is being reconsidered. So perhaps we also need to look at the type of patient. As I said, not all patients will be suited for participation. In the same way, not all researchers or members of the or potential members of an ethics committee are suited to be members of the ethics committee. It will have to be based upon, let's say, ability to participate in the ethical review of a particular trial.
Does that
Thank you, Nancy.
answer your question, Pavel?
Yeah, I want to ask.
So in the meanwhile, while we're waiting for feedback from Pavel, I would like to maybe give a couple of additional hints towards the risk-based approach in this sense. And I'm glad that Nancy, you mentioned the GCP addendum recently. So it's a shame to me, to my mind, that the patient are mentioned there, but maybe not in primary focus, whereas the risk-based approach is very much extended there with chapter 5.0 mostly. And I think we can do more in this regard and also combine these both approaches because actually a lot of realized risks that you see in clinical studies are due to lack of engagement of a patient. And I'm going to give this as a brief maybe introduction towards this topic, and maybe a couple of examples. So as you might remember, the risk-based approach in the clinical studies is divided into certain steps where we go through the protocol assessment, risk control, risk detection, and history. So this is also regarding the GCP addendum. The patient engagement activities mostly come into the first three stages and first three areas. So, of course, during the whole study overall, but the initial mitigation actions, so to say, the actions that might reduce the risks connected with the lack of patient engagement, they are starting here. So Nancy mentioned the co-development of protocol together with patients. Risk assessment, for example, the assessment, so the risks connected with loss to follow-ups, with unscheduled visits, with compliance to protocol, compliance to medication. These are could be addressed on this stage in risk assessment part, and in risk control, the mitigation actions could be addressed. And why it is important to have them, to have this actually in the early stages, because the impact due to risk materialization is not linear. And the impact develops through the clinical study or maybe after the clinical study really exponentially. I'll give you a simple example. The loss to follow-ups might be a really big problem. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Pröwe, who worked in Bayer for 35 years, told us a story, real story from clinical studies where Bayer needed to pay for private investigators in order to find those patients who were lost actually after the treatment phase. So they landed into the area where it cost a lot to a company to finish a study just due to loss to follow-ups patient. Whereas if they would do some mitigation actions in the early stages and more encourage patients to stay in a study and to provide additional information about their well-being, this would be much less for the pharma company. And some more examples might be provided here, but again, due to lack of time, I have to continue. The major benefits actually that you would gain through the involvement of patient engagement topic actually into the whole design, whole ecosystem of your clinical study is better design phase. So your clinical study becomes more holistic, more compliant, and you address those risks that might materialize and have materialized in the past. Again, loss to follow-up is one of them, but the adherence to the medication and protocol is also another one. At the end, better outcome as a result for the whole study, maybe addressed. And by the way, you don't need to forget that one of the most successful pharma organizations, which, for example, so company Genzyme, which was acquired by Sanofi, was organized by patients themselves. So the patients are even going and organizing clinical studies now. So and that what made them very successful and very beloved by many patients, because they knew that there is genuine wish to help, particularly in rare diseases. Proactive execution, so putting some key risk indicators about measuring patient engagement is also possible. Measuring the adherence to the visit schedule, seeing what kind of adverse events, how the adverse events are documented, and what is the rate of adverse events by site. This is what might help a lot into identifying the issues early before you continue to analyze the data, before you make a database log. And prospective learning. At the end of the study, you extract the information you accumulated about the most successful mitigation actions with patient engagement, most successful actions, and you include them in the next study and maybe roll out for in a bigger scale of the full organization, communicating success stories in conferences and within organization further on. Again, this is very useful, and again addressed by GCP addendum to make happen. So with these words, I would like to thank everybody who joined us today. we are a bit out of time. I don't know if we can address questions so far, or should we? I think we can stay for a couple of minutes more if there are some questions, and we can address maybe late questions later over email.
I'm sure this hour is the onset of a continued discussion. Some people already indicated that they are interested to learn more about risk-based approach and patient engagement and involvement. Perhaps in the future we can consider a follow-up webinar. Meanwhile, I haven't seen any new questions coming in, but I saw a couple of big thank yous to Nancy and Artem. Thank you for that. Tomorrow I will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and also I will include a schedule for other webinars that are scheduled until the end of December. Also, there is, because this month is dedicated to diabetes, it's Diabetes Awareness Month. Last week we had the World Diabetes Day. For this purpose, we created a special package, our Attract Pro package, together with the Diabetes Rect. Diabetes Rect is a indication-focused Rect library. I will mention that information in my email. There's an interesting offer. You can try it out for 30 days and then with a discount continue the license. Again, another person is thanking us. I guess we can start to wrap up. Maybe you can scroll through one or two more slides with contact information, Artem. So this is where you can reach us, basically first name, surname @syntegrity.com. Follow us please on LinkedIn. Our corporate page is called Syntegrity, and our tweets on Twitter. Next slide. And I will mention more about Attract Pro in our follow-up mail tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us and hope to see you next time again. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Okay. Bye-bye.